Okay, we're going to get started just because it is a 30-minute session. Welcome to Driving Towards the Future of Smooth and Secure User Access with Librarians and CIOs. I'm Gwen Evans. I'm the Vice President of Global Library Relations at Elsevier. I want to express my sincere appreciation for those with the fortitude and stamina, both mental, physical, and emotional, to join us today. And I'm sure that includes my fellow presenters. They are Nancy Kirkpatrick, the Executive Director and CEO of OhioNet, one of the library consortia in Ohio. Colette O'cary, the Global Director of the Seamless Access Initiative at Elsevier, who's having a little trouble connecting, so just to warn you. And Paul Shopis, Consultant and Retired Executive Director of ORNet, the higher education internet service provider for the state of Ohio. I'll be drawing on my previous experiences, the former Executive Director of OhioLink and colleague of Paul at that state agency. So we're going to briefly present some overarching themes and perspectives from two very recent webinars. Then we're going to have a panel discussion highlighting some deeper cuts and takeaways that we all noticed. Please put any of your questions or thoughts in the chat panel and we'll incorporate them into the discussion. So the first event was a mini symposium which featured librarians and CIOs speaking to each other about their perspectives on privacy, security, and access to digital content. The second was a scholarly network security initiative seminar featuring librarians, CIOs, CISOs, or chief information security officers, and security experts presenting and discussing threats to the academic enterprise, including researcher and publisher data and intellectual property, which had a lot to do with patron privacy and security. Participants at both events stressed the critical need for collaboration to address everybody's concerns. The participants' backgrounds are on those linked pages, so please take a look at their bios as they covered a really wide range of experience and institutional affiliation. So as starting for context for how far we've come, the CIO of the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, Jack Seuss, he showed that over the last 2 decades, remote access has changed pretty radically for both campus and libraries. In 2000, the libraries had dial-up access. They had their own proxy server, which you'll notice didn't work with some databases. And then at the bottom, I'm interpreting that as an ILS-based patron authentication system. A decade later, routes are getting slightly less complicated, but they still require a lot of guidance from the library to get users where they want to go. But in October of 2020, there are no longer any library-specific instructions at all because the campus has gone to federated authentication and single sign-on for everything. The only library instructions he could find were archived in an FAQ. So I'm presenting the librarian perspective, and I expect a lot of the participants in this are librarians, but it was an interesting presentation for the CIOs and the other participants who were not librarians. So Lisa Hinchliffe from the University of Illinois covered the history of the US librarian commitment to the anonymity that we feel needs to be afforded to reading and the relationship to freedom of thought and academic freedom. As I said, it might be familiar territory for librarians, but it was thought-provoking for the other participants. She pointed out that the US government has a history of surveilling or trying to surveil the reading habits of users to determine whether they're a threat to the body politic, ranging from the threat of communism during the Cold War to the threat of terrorism and the resulting Patriot Act. Using the ALA Code of Ethics as responding to this context, she pointed out that privacy for librarians means confidentiality and freedom from scrutiny, and that it covers all libraries, not just academic libraries. Darby Orcutt from North Carolina State University reinforced how fundamental that value is for librarians by stating that privacy is a God term. For those unfamiliar with what that means, it's a term or a concept that is positive, potent, but vague. Lisa and all the librarians emphasize that there's a balance that librarians have to strike between that commitment to privacy and a parallel or equally important commitment to service at the highest levels. And it has become very complicated in this increasingly digital and networked world. Jim O'Donnell, the university librarian at Arizona State, referenced their mission for inclusion as a public institution, which librarians are very familiar with at other public campuses. And ASU librarians Deborah Hankin-Kurtz and Jeremy Kurtz walked through how they handle various categories of users and what might be called edge cases that might be unfamiliar to some CIOs and are unfamiliar to publishers, although libraries, as we know, are increasingly called upon to handle these situations, both technically and in licensing terms. So what's the current state? How do we take these fundamental values and increasingly complex use cases and apply them in the current context? Darby and Lisa Harrison from Galileo provided some pointers or food for thought. Remember the vagueness of God terms? What does privacy mean in an environment where the weakest link in our privacy is the rest of our digital lives and the phone in our pocket? And in terms of service provision at the highest levels, librarian bias towards privacy often conflicts with what users expect of their applications and devices. How do we prioritize librarian principles if they come into conflict with one another? So that's the broad overview. And now I will move on to Paul, who will give the CIO perspective.
Yeah, thanks, Gwen. And I would like to note that the CIOs, this is kind of a just kind of a readout of their perspectives, but it was Melissa Wu from Michigan State University, Jack Seuss from University of Maryland, as Gwen already mentioned, and Don Welch from the Pennsylvania State University. And CIOs historically have supported libraries, and libraries and the CIO's offices are serving the same constituencies. Most CIOs are really interested in providing good services to their constituents. And librarians and CIOs really are not very far apart on desired outcomes. In other words, both groups actually care a lot about privacy and maintaining that privacy for students, faculty, and researchers. Both CIOs and librarians need to listen to one another and be creative in their solution sets. I do think that CIOs hearing from librarians about the real legitimate concerns about privacy and what someone's been reading really resonated with them, and they understand that. Also, the CIOs talked a bit about privacy and security, and that they should not be conflated to mean the same thing. They're related, but they're not exactly the same thing. Privacy basically is a compliance issue. In other words, that can be articulated and one can measure whether you're complying with it or not. And security is basically mitigating risk. So there again, you have ways of and metrics of measuring that. And that should not be conflated as well. Security should not be conflated with hazard. Hazard is something that's an immediate threat that may or may not be quantifiable in any compliance kind of framework. CIOs don't necessarily want to have strict IT centralization. There's been a lot of movement on that in a lot of larger campuses of late, but they're really they're really interested in agreement across the enterprise of standards and processes. One of the big things that really resonates with the CIO community is the vendor licensing compliance. That's a good deal of what they have to deal with in their activities. And that there can be a corner case issue for people that are not directly affiliated with the university. Say, for example, I believe it was Arizona State was talking about that they have a facility for retired adults that they're opening up, and as part of the deal, that the residents there will have access to library services. And Federation works really well in that kind of a scenario. Some of the other concerns they had was that service matters a lot, whether we like it or not. Most of our users have come to expect frictionless services, and it does require some trade-offs. And that to make all of this work, there has to be a web of trust, and that trust needs to be scalable. And that's something that Federated ID helps address. And most campus services, at least at most larger campuses, almost all services use single sign-on these days to get access to them. And finally, there are some, although at the federal level, there's not a lot happening. Some states are starting to articulate privacy requirements for students. And a specific case mentioned during our symposium was Maryland is actually going to be articulating that for all students at state universities in the state of Maryland. So that's pretty much it. And I will hand it off to who's next?
I'm next.
Okay, go ahead, Nancy.
Thanks, Paul. So as a multi-type consortia, one of the challenges that we have is that we support this level of IT support at scale, right? So we have 25 members, for example, in a small group, and we run several groups that are 25 or so. And so in a perfect world, and I think this is maybe what vendors think of, and maybe even what some campus IT think, all of those IT professionals are connected to each other, right? Every library has an IT professional who is then talking to the other IT professionals at each library system, and they all work together on a consortial level to make sure that access is happening the way that it should be. But reality is completely different. Reality is there's potentially one person, thank you, Gwen, who's doing that IT, not for each individual school, but one person for all 25 institutions. And that one person is not even on campus. They're at the OhioNet offices providing service from a remote point for all of those institutions. So the level, so when we're looking at any sort of solution, I guess the point here is that we really needed to be able to scale not just at the campus level, but consortially, so that we can provide appropriate support for our members and make sure that they have everything that they need. I know that some vendors get that and some CIOs get it, but it's surprising to me how often we come across these questions and surprise from them that they don't have, that the infrastructure there is not what they might think it is. So for us, the biggest challenge is making sure that whatever solution we have, whatever way that we're providing support, knowing that we have to do that same thing 25 times for one group, and then 25 times for another group, and then 25 times for a third group. And one person is responsible for doing that, plus the 1,800 other things that are part of their job. So scale matters, size matters when it comes to consortial level support. And I think I'm going to pass it on. Well, actually, Gwen, I'm going to pause for a second and see. Oh, you're muted.
We are trying to.
Oh, I see Colette. Okay.
Okay.
Perfect timing, Colette.
So our fourth panelist is Colette O'cary, and Colette, you're still muted. I'm going to give you a second to settle in.
Okay, can you hear me? Gwen, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
All right. All right, finally. So out of the two events, one of the things that stuck out for me most is this quote: "Federation is a good problem to focus on." And this is something that Melissa Wu, who is the CIO at University of Michigan, said. So then when you look at these three entities, right? So if I start with the CIOs who run IT departments at campuses in the middle, right? Because they are the connecting glue between publishers, vendors, and libraries when it comes to provision of electronic access. The other thing that Melissa said also that stuck out for me was there are issues around providing access to the right people at the right time, right? So, there's focus on user experience, identity management, cybersecurity risk, and mitigation. And then when I take a look at publishers, vendors, and also libraries, what I then see is also that the same issues are also being talked about, right? With these other entities, particularly when it comes to cybersecurity risk mitigation. These are three things that all three parties are talking about, but not necessarily all talking about them together, right? So the library or publishers and libraries might talk about any number of these topics, with their interactions, and the CIOs and with their office might be telling the library about risk and identity management, but very often it doesn't go the other way around, or it's not a kind of a two-way conversation. So, and when we talk about cybersecurity risk mitigation, things around ransomware, there are reports about ransomware attacks. Linda Van Kuren from Georgetown University Medical Center Library also talked about that. Libraries being attacked, and since libraries also hold the research data of the university, so there's very valuable intellectual property assets that libraries are responsible for. So it behooves the libraries then to really do what's necessary, or partner with IT departments, publishers, and vendors to really reduce the risk. And what does Federation have to do about all of this? And in the conversation that in the presentation by Linda, she said that they moved to federated access as a way to help them reduce the risk, right? And this is also one thing that I think Melissa Wu and the other CIOs were pointing to. And similarly for publishers, it's also the same thing that publishers, especially if I look at Elsevier and some others, also when you look at the Seamless Access Initiative, are trying to point to about not just risk mitigation, but also user experience, right? And this is why Federation is a good problem to focus on, to try and figure this out and work at it as sort of a community effort to make it better than it is today.
Now we're going to move to a discussion among themselves that we would love if you participate in the chat or if you have questions, because certain things really struck us in both of these conversations and presentations. And I'll start with one of the things that I've been thinking about as I reflected back on the CIO librarian conversation, and Lisa and Darby contributions, is that the risk that we feel from our activities or our user behavior, or particularly what we're reading, has really blown out of the library. And the metaphor that I use is, are librarians worried about a dripping faucet when the hurricane has taken off the roof and blown your private papers all over town, and the storm surge is in your basement taking all your furniture and floating it down Main Street? Because we started thinking about, well, when you put a link in Zoom to something, does Zoom know what you are reading? When our library catalogs are open on the internet and anyone can access those files or trace those interactions, does it really matter to someone who wants to surveil you if you actually checked the book out when they can see what you're looking at? Or the other thing is not worry about, but I think about it, is now it's so easy to trace the connections between us. When I share something on Goodreads or I mention something on Twitter, that actually implicates my entire network, so that anyone who wants to surveil that can see not just what I'm doing, but they also have pointers to what the people around me might be interested in because they follow me or they're connected to me. So those are sort of some of the things that came up in the very lively discussion, or that I've been thinking about as you know, more things happen in the world and we talk more about privacy and the internet. So that's what came up for me immediately. Paul, did anything particularly strike you?
I think you're raising really good points there. And I would say for average users, yeah, there's a lot of ways to get information about someone. If someone's determined to surveil you, there are some countermeasures you can take as a user, such as using VPNs, but then you have to trust that the VPN user that you're using actually isn't, you have no way of actually knowing for sure. So the closest we can really come is to try to articulate, rather than have it be an open shooting match, if you will. It strikes me that the right way to approach this is that you have contractual obligations that you enter into with others that to keep your information safe. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to do it, but at least you've articulated exactly what the expectation is. And it does provide you with at least a civil remedy should they violate that contract.
Nancy, anything that immediately speaks to you about
the thing that jumped out to me actually was on Colette's slide where he was showing the librarians, the CIOs, and the vendors, that kind of that three-prong and all those different conversations that are going back and forth. Yes, thank you. And how in many instances, at least for our members, for smaller libraries, there isn't a CIO to help with some of those things. So these conversations are taking place directly between library and publisher, or even if there is an IT department involved, when it comes to the licensing, the librarians aren't necessarily thinking to bring in IT to ask questions about that, or there's nobody to consult. So I wonder from a relationship standpoint, what can we do to improve those conversations so that it is, that the important stakeholders really are part of the conversation.
I do remember that the team from Arizona State University, and I think it was either Jack or Don Welch from Penn State, were talking about the way they developed those relationships was projects at lower levels. So yes, maybe the library director talked to the CIO twice a year or had regular meetings, but it was really those more on the ground conversations that really developed the kind of relationships that allowed people to have useful conversations and understand the real technical challenges or the real policy challenges, because that came up a lot. It was really about policy, human relationships, and the web of trust that you had to develop to make sure everybody's concerns are taken care of. Colette, do you want to talk a little more about that web of trust and federated authentication?
Yeah, it's really in the conversations that happened, there seems to be this kind of like mystery, right? So different parties have the ideas of federated authentication and privacy, right? So there's like these dyed-in-the-wool ideas or conceptions about privacy with IP authentication. So therefore, anything different than that is probably not something that could be trusted. And also because federated authentication involves using personal identifiable or logging in, because it involves that, therefore it's not privacy protected. And what I kept hearing over and over again is that in order to get past that web of distrust, I should say, there ought to be a conversation, really a three-way conversation, right, between the library, central IT, and and vendors, right? around all these different issues, right? Because one of the things, just thinking about it, again, from Linda Van Kuren's presentation, was that there is a way to talk to a particular vendor about, the attributes that are being released, right? And then also when you think about the work being done with seamless access, that where they're trying to standardize the attribute release, that is another part of the conversation to really create a very strong web of trust around privacy, and especially in the context of federated access.
So we have a comment from the chat in response to my comments. There's lots of evidence that students care about their privacy and want their university to respect it. And there's a reference to the majority of a Gary Price article, the majority of Virginia Commonwealth University students refuse to participate in Wi-Fi tracking program. And that was brought up. Lucy and Lisa both talked about the ability or their own habits of moving back and forth between, sometimes I want to be tracked because it delivers more services to me, but sometimes I will open an incognito browser window because I don't want to be tracked. And there was a discussion about the sort of, is the library being too protective when users don't want it, versus moving to a system where users know what is being released about them and are able to choose when and whether they want those attributes or that information released, depending on their own purposes. And Lisa made a really good point, is that nobody wants it to be either or forever. We want to be able to move back and forth. And one of the things that I found interesting in her overview was, and this might have been in another seminar that she was giving, that a lot of librarians think federated authentication is relatively new and came out of the RA21 program. And Paul will laugh at that because federated authentication has been around for a very long time. Shibboleth is an installation of that. It's an open source program. It's community developed, and it is under the control of the CIOs on campus. So moving to that is actually, again, talking about the web of trust, many institutions and CIOs take part in Common and the development of federated authentication, and it moves control of information onto campus instead of third parties. And one of the interesting things that Lisa brought up was publishers using Google Casa, for example, as an authentication method, when that really doesn't involve the campuses at all. It involves the user, but Google is asserting the ability to authenticate users without involving the library or campus at all, which I think is a really interesting point. Anyone else? We have about 2 minutes left.
I would like to make one observation. I think it was, I think I captured it correctly. It's kind of along the lines of giving that power of decision making to the end user, and that is, it is a policy question. But I believe during the ARS symposium, one of the polls, I believe most people don't know who on their campus is responsible for developing those policies.
Yes.
Which I think is a good question to ask on your campus is, campuses are concerned about this, and there's a lot of liabilities involved, at least from a legal perspective, and just finding out who makes these decisions and how do I get a seat at the table is probably a good question to ask.
Well, and I do know of a campus who was the subject of a cybersecurity attack, and they are going through an audit, a security audit run by their CISO, and they were told that they had to shut down what librarians would consider a really core piece of library technology providing service. And I have been on the other side of that. If a CISO tells you you have to do something, there's a lot of, there's not much room to talk back or say, no, I'm supporting the entire, state of Ohio with something. So there are real risks to libraries, to campuses, and to users. And the best, I think, remedy that participants were talking about is to come together to discuss everybody's needs and discuss a robust method of addressing these, because there's risks for all kinds of things that we consider core to the mission of providing access. And the other thing that I think, just for the last comment was that how much trust there was in the librarian community to be the ones to provide user education and user training on this. And to Adam Tandler's point about students care about it, I noticed that Carnegie Mellon has a privacy day, or you could imagine privacy being integrated into orientation activities on campus. So everybody was pointing to librarians to take up the mantle, which a lot of them already have, for educating users about the implications. So I think we are out of time, unless anybody in the chat has more questions or comments. Okay, thank you very much, and have a good rest of the day. Thank you again on behalf of our panelists.
Thank you all.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.